All right, well, we're just going to launch right in here. No long introductions, really. And since I'm not giving the guests any long introductions, I thought it appropriate that I not get a long introduction. But I'm director of the Asian Studies Center here at the Heritage Foundation. My name is Walter Lohman. There's a whole basket of issues involved here in China's soft power. And I know we're going to talk to some extent about the phenomenon of the Confucius Institutes and the role they play. But I just wanted to highlight one thing, and that's what sort of most recently has brought this issue to my attention, which was Fred Hyatt's article in the Washington Post detailing the travails of China scholar Perry Link. He put this article out in November. But I thought it really important because it got to the cost of self-censorship. And to a large extent, I think that's what the exercise of soft power from Beijing is all about, is to get people to make this easy and do it themselves. This is just a quote from Fred's article. The costs to the American public are serious and not well appreciated. And he's quoting Perry Link on this. The costs to the American public are serious and not well appreciated. It's deeply systematic and accepted as normal among China scholars to sidestep Beijing's demands by using codes and indirections. One does not use the term Taiwan independence, quote unquote. For example, it's, quote, cross-straits relations. One does not mention Liu Xiaobao, the Nobel Peace Prize winner who is now in prison. Even the word liberation, quote unquote, to refer to 1949 is accepted as normal. Academics understand the code. Link says to Hyatt's quoting him here, quote, but when scholars write and speak to the public in this code, the public gets the impression that 1949 really was a liberation, that Taiwan independence really isn't much of an issue, and that Nobel Prize winner in prison really is not much to talk about. I would add to this sort of code that we use when talking about China now, new model of major power relations, which seems to be a phrase that we use as well. The Chinese put it out there, and then we pick it up as code. So I just wanted to highlight that at the beginning. That is that the net effect of China's soft power is to get American scholars and the American government, if successful, to talk about things in the terms that they want us to talk about. So when we talk about Taiwan, we don't call Taiwan a country, because it might offend the Chinese to call it a country. It is a country, of course, or we don't, like he says, we don't talk about Taiwan independence, or we don't talk about freedom of expression in China. We self-censor ourselves all of the time to accommodate Chinese interests. So we've got a few panelists here to help us through this issue. First, Stephanie Kleine-Ahlbrandt. Stephanie is director of the Asian Pacific program at the U.S. Institute of Peace. She's been there since August 2013. Previously, she set up and ran the Beijing office of the International Crisis Group for 5 years. She's written extensively on China's foreign policy, including China's views of the strategic environment, Chinese-U.S. relations, and many other issues besides. Again, keeping the bio short here with all due respect to your long and distinguished biography. Dean Cheng is actually with the Heritage Foundation. He's senior research fellow here. He's been here for more than 4 years now. He was 13 years as senior analyst, first with SEIC and then with CNA. Hella Dale is Heritage Foundation's senior fellow in public diplomacy studies. Hella joined Heritage in 2002 as deputy director of the Davis Institute here. She was also once director of our Allison Center. Hella's career started in journalism and in the good old days of the Washington Times. She was editor of the op-ed page there. So with that, why don't I turn it over to Stephanie? She'll get us started, and hopefully we'll have some time for Q&A.
I didn't realize I was going first, but okay. No, it's all good. It's all good because I'm focusing mostly on the ASEAN quotient, and I'm not going to go in too much to definitions of soft power and these types of things. But I do actually prefer the definition of attraction than soft power. I mean, soft power to a certain extent is a notion of attraction. I think that the Chinese think that you can use the government and money to buy soft power, essentially, and that's not quite working. But the practice of soft power became, especially under Hu Jintao, an attractive policy option for China alongside its desire to demonstrate its commitment to a peaceful rise. So, particularly during the Hu Jintao era, you saw Beijing using an increasing array of foreign policy tools beyond material hard power in its interactions, especially in East and Southeast Asia, which is the region that I'm focusing on in my talks today. This includes development assistance, trade, cultural exchanges, and the like. However, my conclusion is that China's massive push to project soft power hasn't really translated into more supportive views of its quest for status and legitimacy, and this limited appeal derives from two factors, one of which is Beijing's decision to demonstrate its resolve increasingly on regional territorial disputes with, bordering on military coercion in the East and South China Seas, and also the fact that it's going to be difficult for Chinese government to prevent its domestic record on political and civil freedoms from affecting international credibility. The limited political reform that we've seen on the domestic front has stifled the development of civil society in China, especially with regard to certain political and religious liberties. And as you've seen in Southeast Asia and Africa, by contrast, you have political leaders and civil society organizations, mostly on their own initiative, notwithstanding the color revolutions, et cetera, enshrining universality of human freedoms into charters of the ASEAN and the African Union. So the Chinese government's behavior at home and abroad on human rights issues seems to be at odds with these types of prevailing trends. I think it's important to point out that the Chinese did have a relatively successful strategy in Southeast Asia. Certainly after 1997, the Asian financial crisis, you'll recall that there was a concerted overture made, devaluing the renminbi, negotiating China-ASEAN free trade, support for Chiang Mai Initiative, all in contrast to the harsh medicine at the time that was recommended by the IMF. China's short-term goal there was to reassure the region of its peaceful intent, prevent the development of anti-China coalitions, and build ties that facilitate regional stability in China's internal development. I would say that to a certain extent, this strategy was successful more or less until about 2008. It did help to transform China's image from that of an ideological provocateur to that of a welcome and more pragmatic partner for peace and prosperity. And this was achieved through consistent and strategic high-level attention, adept day-to-day management of relations, and bold policy initiatives. But obviously, the recent tensions and ongoing problems in the Eastern China Sea are shedding considerable light on the limitations of Chinese soft power. There's significant regional concern about China's shift from embracing multilateral diplomacy and soft power to a foreign policy that's more defined in terms of narrow, self-interested terms. And this really all risks losing 20 years of painstakingly accumulated goodwill in Southeast Asia. I think it's important just quickly to do a quick overview of the change between Hu Jintao and Xi Jinping, because I think that it's been more stark than what I would have predicted at the time. I think that a foreign policy that until recently was defensive, reactive, and quite sensitive to the perception of outsiders has really changed very rapidly under Xi Jinping. This obviously has to do with the fact that he was able to relatively rapidly consolidate his power. But I get the sense that he's really making foreign policy with the mindset of a great power, and we haven't really seen that. Certainly we didn't see that under Hu Jintao. In a way, Hu Jintao teed it up for Xi Jinping. The cardinal terms that Chinese used to use in various meetings to describe their own policies and their own activities have really been sloughed off in recent months. You don't really hear that much anymore, things like non-interference, peaceful rise, 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, hide and bide. It's much less prevalent in national discourse. And I get the sense that the sensitivity to perceptions of outsiders has been almost replaced by government sensitivity to opinions of Chinese nationalists and internet users in the country who consistently demand a more active approach by Beijing to protect Chinese interests. To a certain extent, the Chinese they almost have given up. They feel like 90% of international coverage is negative. But I think the Dean will be speaking more about the money that's going into media and these types of things. So under Xi Jinping's leadership, Beijing is increasingly probing U.S. commitment to its allies, opening up chinks that it's been able to exploit to change the status quo. In the region, China's put in a clear policy to become a maritime power and is taking actions directly in consequence, including the consolidation of a bolder maritime law enforcement agency. Globally, Beijing's preparing to play an expanded role in the Middle East and Afghanistan in anticipation of a U.S. drawdown. and we're seeing shifts in 4 areas. We're seeing a shift from non-interference to creative involvement, if not direct interference, a shift away from bilateral to multilateral diplomacy, a shift from reactive to preventative diplomacy, and a move away from strict non-alignment towards semi-alignments. I think that there was optimism amongst Asian and Western commentators that had been following, for example, China's moves in the South China Sea, that the assertive actions we saw in the South China Sea from 2009 to 11 were sort of, that China had learned from those and decided in 2012 to sort of take a more reassuring approach towards its neighbors. There were extraordinary measures taken, impressive demonstrations of hard and soft power, including security, economic, and diplomatic leverage for China to get its way in the South China Sea. I'm not going to mention, I think you read the news enough to see what's going on in terms of the ADIS, the Hainan regulations, the establishment of Sansha City, the Scarborough Shoal incident, which is really the result of a tactic that I've termed reactive assertiveness, where Vietnam, the Philippines, or Japan make a move that could be sort of a 3 on a scale, and then China takes advantage of that to sort of make a move that could be an 8 or a 9 on the scale in order to change the status quo in its favor, because it feels that the power balance in the region is shifting and that it doesn't need anymore to really be taking grief from countries, small countries like the Philippines, Vietnam, Japan, and the like. But I think, and I think it's important to point out this sort of the no-show of Obama to the region in as we were grappling with our national crisis. Xi fully profited from this, right? It wasn't planned. He didn't know about it, but he pointedly visited 2 countries Obama had canceled. He buttered up ASEAN as he talked about Chinese backing for Asian infrastructure investment, fast action on Pan-Asian Railway, splashing cash all around the region. Li Keqiang and Xi have continued this diplomacy, brandishing trade and investment deals that a still troubled economy can't match, right, while seeking joint oil and gas deals. But I think that most of that stuff has been hard power with a dose of soft power. I think right now we have a 2-pronged approach inside Beijing. There's a sense of urgency to more proactively counter what are seen as threats, and certainly we're part of that. Certainly we're seen as a country that wants to be present in the region in a way that China feels is inconsistent with its rising power. And China's really looking to shape a more positive security environment along its borders. And this has included new diplomatic activism towards its neighbors. So quickly, there was a Politburo meeting in July. There have been code of conduct consultations in September, and there was an October work conference, all of which sort of signals a new sort of ASEAN Charm Offensive 2, which actually coexists. So it's an outreach, Chinese outreach. They're being much more sophisticated in ways in which they're dealing with ASEAN, finding much more creative ways to put money in pockets of ASEAN countries, and trying to be, let's say, nice to the countries that they feel respect Chinese interests, which of course doesn't include the Philippines and Japan. But this coexists with the continuation of attempts to advance their own maritime claims and push interpretation of permissible activities in the EEZ, which was the result, which was seen in this Cowpens incident, right? Where there was a sense that as China increasingly had access to Guam, maybe it would be less irritated by an interpretation of EEZ activities that allowed military surveillance activities, but we've seen that perhaps that's not the case. How much more time? I'm supposed to just sort of, I'm pretty much done, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, I will wrap it up here and turn it over. I didn't think I was going to go first, so I was going to wait to see what they said and then see what I was going to put in, but I had to sort of, great, thanks.
That's all right, that's a good start.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, good morning. I'm going to be following up Stephanie's comments by saying some of the things that I think might have worked a little better if we had gone first, but it'll all turn out in the end. As I'm sure, as Stephanie and everyone in this room, I'm sure, is already aware of, there's been a host of issues and incidents over the past year that ranging from the Sino-Japanese concerns over the Senkakus, the establishment of the ADIS, the near collision with the USS Cowpens, and at the end of the year, the promulgation of new fishing regulations. All of these are more hard power focused, but there is also a soft power element to all of this. And it comes together in some of Admiral Locklear, commander of Pacific Command's comments, about how on the one hand we have the Chinese clearly posing a challenge militarily to the United States. U.S. superiority can no longer be taken as a given. But his hope that China would become a security provider rather than a security consumer. And the reason why this is striking is because the implication here is that China in some ways will become like us. And that in turn, I would suggest, is part of a larger Chinese effort to present themselves as not big, bad, and scary, which goes to the heart of soft power. It touches on a lot of things that Stephanie mentioned. And it also goes to how the Chinese conceive of security, which is the idea of comprehensive national power. And comprehensive national power, for those of you who aren't familiar with that term, and if any of you folks have come here before and heard me, I'm surprised, because I know that this is one of my little hobby horses, includes not only military and economic aspects, which are some of the obvious ones, but also science and technology, how China is perceived, diplomatic power, political unity at home, but also, and here in particular I think is important, is cultural security. And Hu Jintao, in fact, in December of 2012, gave a major speech on the importance of cultural security. But lest people think that this was somehow Hu Jintao's unique take on things, I would suggest that the whole issue of cultural security, in fact, ties into a much longer-standing Chinese fear of what Deng Xiaoping, the consummate reformer, termed westernization, that China should not, and in some ways cannot, westernized without calling into question its very inherent nature and being. And that, in turn, you can actually see threads of that all the way back to the Qing dynasty, when, in the wake of the Opium Wars, there was a movement in China to modernize, the way Japan had modernized. And conversely, there was a very strong reaction, which you didn't see as much of in Japan, countering that. And ultimately, Chinese modernization under the Qing, of course, failed, and the rest of the 20th century has seen the consequences of that. China, furthermore, sees itself still, in some ways, as a developing country, and therefore has more fear, more concern, paranoia in some ways, but insecurity in fundamental ways that you would not expect from a country that is the #2 economy in the world. You think of China, many people think of it as a nation with a majority of the world's construction cranes. But if you are Xi Jinping, if you're Hu Jintao, if you're Jiang Zemin, you have been thinking of yourself as a country that is still playing catch-up. And in this context, the power of the West is not simply carrier battle groups and B-2 bombers and the like, but also the appeal of the Western model, the appeal of Westernization, the appeal of everything from democracy to alternative culture and perspective. And I think that the Chinese play on all of this through the forms and are concerned about political warfare, because all of these non-hard power aspects feeds into what the Chinese think of. And by the way, this is a term that we used. This is a term that the Soviets used as well, political warfare. In the 1950s, this was something that all of the major players were employing, because for the same reasons. The recognition that hard power has limited applicability in some ways. Nobody really wants to actually engage in strikes on each other's military forces or countries. Military power is as important as a backdrop, as a context. But in that case, how is the competition between major powers expressed? And here I would fundamentally disagree with Admiral Locklear, because Admiral Locklear's implication is that there doesn't have to be competition at all. We can, in fact, simply expect them to do as we do, because it is in their interest, when in fact soft power is a mechanism by which China can challenge the status quo without necessarily taking everyone to the brink. Now, because time is limited and I do want to make sure that there is time for Q&A, let me note here that the use of political warfare blurs the line and crosses the line between peacetime and overt wartime. And one of the most important aspects of this is the issue of public opinion warfare. shaping and molding how you are talked about, how you are perceived. The Confucius Institutes are part of public opinion warfare. The expansion of China's media globally is an aspect of public opinion warfare. The effort to shape and mold, as Walter noted from Perry Link, of even the acceptable terminology of how one talks about China is part of public opinion warfare. Why is public opinion warfare important? The Chinese cite a concrete example. In 2003, the United States went to the United Nations for permission authorization to engage in what became known as Operation Iraqi Freedom. And the U.S., unfortunately, failed to obtain that. From the Chinese perspective, then, the American decision to go to war without UN authorization should have elicited a global backlash. There should have been countries that would go and help Iraq. Now, as Americans, we think that's rather silly. If you're the Chinese, first off, it's not silly. But second of all, what is striking, what is stunning to them, is not one country, not one nation was going to challenge the starting assumption that Saddam Hussein's a bad guy. Whether or not he had WMD, whether or not he had anything else, nobody thought that Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, should receive assistance. From the Chinese perspective, that's frightening. Because potentially then, in the event of some kind of conflict involving China, would it be possible that that if the UN and other things didn't authorize it, nonetheless no one would be willing to help China, that in fact China would be contained and constrained, whether it was literal physical warfare, war, political conflict in a softer sense, sanctions, limits on engagement, limits on the ability of Chinese leaders to move about. The Spanish court recently passed judgment on some of the Chinese leaders at the time of Tiananmen, a la Pinochet, that they might be subject to arrest. These are things that worry the Chinese very much. And so they have promulgated a political line. They talk about the importance of how China is perceived. They have a global media network to make sure that China will never be as isolated, as vilified, as contained as Iraq. And when you are the #2 economy in the world and you have rather substantial hard currency accounts, you have an awful lot of opportunity and a lot of means to help shape global public opinion.
Yes. Well, thank you, Dean, and thank you, Stephanie. Those were fantastic presentations. And I'm going to focus a little bit more on the way that Americans might be experiencing China's soft power offensive, as we call it in the title of this program today. When I was at the Washington Times, as Walter mentioned, I was on the editorial page, and we had written an editorial about Taiwan, a country that many of us admire greatly, and mentioning it, of course, as a country with a government. And we got a very long letter from the Chinese embassy, the People's Republic of China, taking us to task for using these terminologies. This is not a country, and that's not a government. And the United States government does not regard this as a separate country. So you will have to retract this publicly. And we were just stunned because it seemed that nobody actually knew that we were an independent organization, and furthermore that our arguments were very good, but it was so extremely heavy-handed. This was back in the 1990s, and we had a good laugh over it, and we ran it, and you know. But since then, in the first decade, particularly of the 21st century, Chinese soft power started becoming a lot more sophisticated. And the Confucius Institutes, which I'm going to speak a bit about, are a part of a much more sophisticated approach. Also, as Dean mentioned, the global media conglomerate that China is constructing, all the finessing of local relations, as Stephanie talked about. These are examples of a more nuanced approach to soft power diplomacy. Though really, I mean, I think for the Chinese government, it all comes down to the question of power. We tend to look at hard power being military and soft power being foreign aid and trade and everything else. And in the U.S. government, currently, certainly there is a great preference for soft power. But the Chinese have melded all of it in what CSIS called smart power, and which was embraced by the Obama administration, where you really meld all your elements of power into one strategy, focused on one country or one region or one purpose. Now, the Confucius Institutes came into being, first saw the light of day in 2004, 10 years ago. The University of Maryland was one of the first recipients of the Confucius Institute. It is a center for Chinese learning. It is a home for Chinese curriculum that is offered to institutions of higher education, not just here in the United States, but all over the world. So from the inception in 2004, the very first one I think was in South Korea, but University of Maryland, dating all the way back there. There are now more than, I think, more than 600, the numbers vary, but more than 600 of these institutes all over the world, hosted at local universities, who receive a grant of $100,000 or more for their Chinese studies program. Many universities here in the United States, and certainly all over the world, do not have the financial resources or the academic resources to undertake a study of China in such a serious way, and many have indeed embraced this gift, maybe sometimes without looking the gift horse in the mouth the way they should have. Currently, there are in the United States more than 70 institutes at universities, from the University of Maryland, the College of William and Mary, very prestigious institutions all over the United States. Some receive whole buildings, some receive a floor in a department. It can be staffed with professors from China, or American professors can go and study there and get up to speed on their skills. It is a flagship of Beijing's public diplomacy program, and its purpose is to further the teaching of Chinese language and culture. Well, nothing wrong with that. But once you have sort of let the Chinese cat out of the bag in your Asian Studies department, certain things can also happen, as Walter mentioned in the article, the column by Fred Hyatt back in November. People who have accepted those funds and have accepted the approach from China now also find that their academic freedom can be compromised, because they will be hearing from their generous donors when something happens that is not to their liking. Concerns have been raised at universities here in the United States. There was a long report from Britain about the impact of Confucius Institutes in Britain. And Sweden and Vietnam have also seen reports produced on the subject of how the academic atmosphere takes a turn once the Confucius Institute opens. We may also note the sort of the intelligent design of this, because of course Confucius is not a philosopher who has been much in favor with the Chinese communists, yet choosing this rather innocuous sounding name, shows you perhaps, or would indicate, that we're now about to study, thousands of years of Chinese philosophy, whereas in fact there will be, there is an entirely different purpose behind the exercise. The model that the Chinese government looked at were America centers, which have been part of American public diplomacy dating back to World War II, the German Goethe Institutes, the British Council, very successful, Alliance Française. All of these, however, are not integrated into an academic institution in their host country. Everybody knows what they are and what they stand for, and that they are representatives of the country that pays the bill. in the case of the Confucius Institutes, they integrate themselves into the academic structures and thereby are able to influence the debate much more insidiously. Now, we had a bit of an eye-opening experience on the subject here in the United States Capitol about 4 years ago. There was a hearing on Capitol Hill with where Hillary Clinton was answering to must have been the House Foreign Relations Committee at the time, about what our public diplomacy efforts in the world were up to and what competition we had. And it came out that those 70 Confucius Institutes funded by China are matched by nothing of the same order hosted by the United States in their country. There is a total imbalance in the Chinese public diplomacy outreach. Their push has been massive, and ours has been shrinking, which was one of the reasons that people kind of woke up to why this subject is so important. The United States has, I believe, a total of 5 America Centers in China, compared to more than 70 Confucius Institutes in the United States. This is obviously a very, very deliberate strategy. Now, Hillary Clinton was asked why not. And the first reason is they won't let us have more. The second is we can't afford it. Ooh, here's the most powerful economy in the world saying, well, we can't afford to fund the study of American culture in countries as important as China and other places overseas, whereas China can invest, what was it, something like $7 billion they announced they were going to invest in public diplomacy. This was really quite eye-opening, and I'm glad to see that since then, the study of the impact of the Confucius Institutes have been and much more has come out about what they are and what their purpose is. A couple of examples of the impact they've had or tried to have domestically. Democracy Digest, which published an article on this recently, went to the University of Chicago to ask, if they could host a program, for instance, on Tibetan independence. And the head of the program said that he thought that was probably not going to happen, at least not anywhere near where the Chinese scholars funded by China were sitting. Let's see, in a couple of years ago, when the University of Oregon wanted to invite Peng Ming-min, an advocate of Chinese independence, a very famous name, and received a lot of pressure from the Chinese consulate in San Francisco, arguing that this should not happen because it would be out of line. The University of Oregon resisted the pressure, but felt it nonetheless. Another example, College of William and Mary, 2012, wanted to invite the Dalai Lama to speak. He was already in Virginia, had been speaking at UVA, and they had been offered some other Tibetan dignitary, but the students wanted to hear from the Dalai Lama, and boy, did they hear from their representatives of Confucius Institute what they thought about that. William and Mary successfully argued, though, that one, it was the students who wanted to issue the invitation, and secondly, if China pulled out its funds, as it was threatening to do, it would be a far bigger news story with much more negative impact for China. And so actually the visit went through, but they're right there. They can monitor what's going on and they will voice their opinion. Now, what does it all add up to? Well, obviously, it adds up to an element in what our other speakers have said, trying to control the dialogue about China and China's image in the world, and to intimidate those who do not want to follow that line. It's an element that we all should be aware of, and I'm so glad we had such a good turnout today, because it shows that a lot of people are interested and concerned.
Great, thank you, Helen. Well, I was hoping it was all going to add up to the fact that UVA is a much better institution than William and Mary, but then you threw a curveball at the end, and William and Mary.
Sorry, Walter.
Well, I want to open it up to questions. I've got a couple myself, but I don't want to preempt, so we don't have that much time. Yeah, right here. We've got a microphone here. Please identify yourself, if you wouldn't mind.
My name's Arnold Zeitlin, and I teach in Guangzhou from time to time. And I might add that one of the American library centers is in the new U.S. consulate in Guangzhou. Mm-hmm. But because of security reasons, a Chinese has to make an appointment 24 hours in advance to use the place. So you can imagine there's not much of an inflow.
Right.
The question I want to ask is that the Global Times yesterday said that the Chinese soft power effort was arguably, how do they put it, let's see, I have it here, was of arguable efficacy, that's the way they put it. But I'm wondering if there's any indication of how much impact the Chinese soft power has had in the United States or anywhere else.
Maybe anyone want to address that? I mean, you know, I started with the language issue. It definitely has an impact on the choice of language, and then I think our choice of language has impact on policy. One of the things that I'd single out is the use of the word containment, which always I think is an interesting dance we go through, which is the Chinese always accuse us of containment, and then we're always eager. Most of the time we preempt it by saying we're not talking about containment. And I always wonder what kind of impact that has on the Chinese policy process, you know, whether they're purposely keeping us on our back foot, because containment is really kind of a ridiculous charge in this day and age. But is it a way for us to backpedal? So, I mean, as you think through the impact of the soft power, what do you think about that? Why don't you start, Dean?
Well, I think that one of the most interesting things to start on the security side is how China is in some ways Lord Voldemort, he who must not be named.
You say that after Cui Tiankai's op-ed.
No, actually, I said that before Cui Tiankai's.
I'll testify
yes,
to that. Dean has said that for a long time. He just didn't put it in print. That was
yes.
the problem.
Yeah, no, I know.
Japanese said it after.
But yes, there's both the Chinese and the Japanese, and actually it's an example of soft power that works the other way. When you use the word Lord Voldemort, everyone on the planet, certainly anyone who has children above the age of 8, understands exactly who you are talking about. That reference there. And again, this is one of the things that in some ways bothers the Chinese, is that there are very few Chinese characters. Confucius is perhaps one of the few, Sun Tzu might be a rival, of being globally recognized as, who is that? What do you mean? So if you take that as an example, the fact that there is no Chinese version of Lord Voldemort, universally understood and recognized cultural touchstone and reference, then yes, it hasn't yet succeeded. But I do believe that the Chinese are a patient people, and that they also understand that public opinion and soft power is not hard power in all sorts of ways. It isn't physical necessarily, but it also is a very long-term impact. It is like gravitational pull. Gravity doesn't simply, suck planets, despite bad movies, down the maws of stars and things, but over time it shapes everything. And so I would suggest that, whether it is Global Times trying to poo-poo something because it's a party line, because there is more attention paid to Chinese soft power, or whether it is because Global Times' editors are perhaps a little more Western than they care to admit and perhaps are more impatient, I think that in the long run, taking a Tibetan example, when the President of the United States chooses not to meet with the Dalai Lama, as President Obama did, soon coming into office, that suggests an efficacy of soft power. There was no threat that if the U.S. President meets the Dalai Lama that China would nuke Pearl Harbor or impose economic sanctions on the United States. It was simply understood. The Chinese themselves didn't have to say anything. It was just understood the feelings of 1.3 billion Chinese, minus 200 million or so Tibetans, would be hurt. And President Obama obeyed.
Well, I think if you look at this in the long term, in the long run, I think Dean is absolutely spot on, that the image of China is changing. Maybe changing not, in every specific way, but certainly I think over the past 20 years, over the past decade, it has changed enormously. China, particularly cultural, I think China has made huge advances in selling itself. I mean, I believe now I was looking at an index, I think it's now listed as the world's third tourist destination behind the United States and Italy. Has bumped out France. That's no small achievement. Now, what China is able to do in terms of its cultural appeal, which is enormous, its history, its art, it has so much, it's so rich, it's so much to offer. Its political system keeps getting in the way, unfortunately, because it is so unpleasant and behaves in such unpleasant ways that it undermines its own soft power efforts to a good degree. But most people have a very favorable impression of Chinese culture as opposed to Chinese politics. And I think over time that does change perceptions very profoundly. The Beijing Olympics, I think, was an example. Of course, the news stories about the opening ceremonies and things kind of got pretty silly, but China is showing itself as a completely different country, and people are, I think, accepting it as such.
Let me come back, Stephanie, because you talked a lot about Southeast Asia, and is there a big difference in the impact of soft power in the way that the way it was represented in the Charm Offensive that you referenced? It's now ended about 6 years ago, maybe five or 6 years ago. Is there a different way that this interacts in Southeast Asia? My guess is yes, that it doesn't matter so much what Southeast Asian populations think about China, that the Chinese locked in a lot of gains several years ago that are hard to reverse because they're already plugged into the ASEAN system. ASEAN and so they're loath to change, and once you get in there, like the Chinese have, there's not much that you can do. But how does it differ?
I think one has to point out this sinicized, Southeast Asia. Most of these countries have, long-standing histories with China, Chinese populations, et cetera. So they're operating in a different environment. What I think is interesting to compare is the difference in the success of China's soft power in some of the sort of larger economies like South Korea and Japan versus some of the smaller economies, Southeast Asia, and the ones that are particularly susceptible to Chinese sort of pressure or soft power, which would be sort of the Cambodias, Laos, and these types of countries. And I thought it's interesting, there was a full study done relatively recently. In South Korea, the general public tends to rate China's overall soft power more positively than Japan. That's probably not a surprise. But Koreans still rate the U.S. and Japan higher. And South Koreans believe that the U.S. has the greatest economic soft power, closely followed by Japan, with China trailing both countries still by a significant margin. In terms of human capital soft power, Koreans rate China lower than the U.S. and Japan, but generally on par with or above South Korea. They also rate the U.S. and Japan ahead of China in terms of cultural soft power, while the authoritarian political system and questionable human rights record land China obviously much further behind the U.S. and Japan in terms of political soft power. And people, posit that Seoul's proximity to Beijing, geostrategic considerations regarding North Korea probably explain why South Koreans make less of a distinction between China's soft and hard power. And according to Scott Snyder at CFR, about 2/3 of South Koreans held negative views towards China at the end of 2011. And a poll taken in early 2013 showed that 75% of South Koreans were concerned about China's power and influence. So we're seeing unprecedented support for the U.S.-Korean alliance. I think
so it's not working very well.
It's not working well, but it's not working that well. And here's the deal. Countries in Southeast Asia don't want to be told to choose between China and the U.S. They want the U.S. to be in the region to stand up for rule of law, for UNCLOS, for freedom of navigation, for all of these, frankly, ideals and norms. And generally speaking, they haven't wanted us to be too overbearing or left-footed about it. You know, we went in with Hillary Clinton to Hanoi and sort of came into the South China Sea issue, and Vietnam had been lobbying that for years, and finally when we came in, all the ASEANs were like, well, that was great, but could you have just done it a bit more discreetly? You know, like, we got egg thrown on our face. So the biggest fear that these countries have is they're going to have to choose between China and the U.S. But because of China's sort of missteps in the soft power department, which is that whatever money they're spending on Confucius Institutes, et cetera, is overlooked because the AIDs, for example, all of these countries in Northeast and Southeast Asia do the read across for their own region when something happens in the other region, right? So the AIDs has really sharpened the focus and the fear of what China could do. And then that Hainan regulations followed soon thereafter. We're not getting into the technical aspects of the Hainan regulations, shows that China's willing to play on several fronts, which generally they don't like to do. Generally they'll push East China Sea as the highest priority for China, given its desire to be a maritime power and the patriotic education, which has led to a lot of this anti-Japanese sentiment, which is a convenient outlet when Xi Jinping is pursuing a very ambitious reform agenda. So East China Sea is first. Then you get issues like South China Sea and North Korea, et cetera. But what you see now is there's really not a country in North or Southeast Asia that doesn't want the U.S. to be completely present in the region. However, they think we're necessary but completely unreliable. We completely lack credibility. And that's because ASEAN doesn't notice the 99 times you show up to their meetings. They notice the one time that you don't, right? And so we're at this place where, you know, people love us, but you know, we have aircraft carrier diplomacy. It makes them feel secure to a certain extent, but that doesn't really help their government stay in power necessarily. It's sort of the economic relationship. If we want to be present in the region, we have to have a real economic footprint. TPP is helping with that. Hopefully that all goes well. But these countries are feeling increasingly coerced. China has, interestingly, you know, for decades, they put politics to work for economics, right? The idea was economic development. Now, you literally have them taking economic hits for political goals, which you had with the rare earths announcement that really, you know, which sort of sent Japan into, I mean, it was a huge wake-up call for Japanese. And so a lot of countries in Southeast Asia that their economies are completely dependent, very, you know, the trade balance is very uneven on China, are worried what happens when the day comes when they say, and you're seeing this right now, the Philippines and Japan are being punished while the rest of the region is being welcomed, really.
Well, I would argue that the ASEAN and Southeast Asia not wanting to make a choice is just a subset of their not wanting to make a decision or a judgment period on anything.
Yeah.
But that's a good discussion for another day.
Yeah.
Why don't we open up to any other questions?
Leah Liu from Voice of America. I'm just wondering, the recent moves taken by China, what kind of impact it will have on the Obama administration's pivot to Asia, and especially the ADIZ and all that. Thank you.
Yeah. Dean, what do you?
Well, who knows? It might make Secretary Kerry take a break from visiting the Middle East. I believe he is currently on his 12th visit there since assuming position. It makes you wonder sort of if there hadn't been a pivot to Asia, how would he have just gotten an apartment somewhere over there instead? The pivot to Asia was a wonderful phrase. It would be, I submit, far better if there were some substance to it. The lack of substance is a combination of factors, beginning with the larger issue of our own economic problems, which both of the other speakers have also alluded to. You know, we need to get our economic house in order. That means making some hard choices, which will inevitably have effect on military spending as well. That being said, the way sequestration has been implemented undermines most of the ideas behind the pivot to Asia. The Chinese can count, the Japanese can count, the other Asian nations can count. All you have to do is take a look at global math scores to know they can all count. And that is reflect.
We can't, apparently.
Yes, well, and there you go. I mean, that's how we're doing things. It reflects that. You know, if you start reducing pilot training hours, ship steaming days, you know, marine, I think they're still called amphibious readiness groups, the number of days they are out there, and then you say, but we're pivoting, you know, I think the American euphemism is that might be a misrepresentation. You don't want to use any other words. That could get you into political trouble. But at some point, when the Chinese are expanding their military and increasing training and doing all of those sorts of things, you wind up asking the question what that pivot really means. And North Korea hasn't gone away. Chinese naval deployments haven't gone away, and regional tensions haven't gone away. At some point, that pivot, you know, people are going to ask, if you've pivoted, where are the forces? There is a crisis here. Where are the Americans? And, you know, if you show up for 9 out of 10 of the crises, 9 out of 10 of the issues, and you don't show up for one of them, oh my God, the Americans have abandoned us.
Although the Manila, that got us a huge amount of goodwill.
Yes.
Being able to bring in, and that's the kind of capability we need to maintain.
And that is.
Because that's
right.
huge soft power.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And along those lines, it's interesting, I'm glad you brought that up, because that was one of the other things to take into account. The Chinese, in some ways, are not expected to show up. And so when the Chinese didn't send their hospital ship and donated, I think, $100,000 as an initial down payment on one of the worst typhoons in the world, to some extent, the Chinese are able to skate by on a, well, but we don't expect them to show up. And that's sort of one of the interesting conundrums is soft power in some ways works significantly better for China. One, because you start from lower expectations. Two, you start from being a little more backwards. But three, you also have the piece of geography. When people say, please don't make us choose, I think Americans assume, because then we'd have to publicly say we're in your side and we'll alienate the Chinese. I would suggest that as China's economy has risen, China's military capabilities have risen, and matter transportation hasn't gotten to the point where you can beam countries 1 inch further away from where they are. What that means is that China's geographic reality of being right next door and you can't leave may mean that these countries are saying, please don't make us choose because we may choose China. And we don't think of that as a natural default, but it may well be.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, there's a lot we could go into there that is about ASEAN's own strategic decision making. But you know, on the pivot question and how much it's been substantiated, it's interesting that one bit. In fairness, administration's not selling it this way, but I've seen a few articles selling the replacement of the George Washington in Yokosuka with the Ronald Reagan as being a sign of our pivot. So we're basically bringing one ship back for refueling, and we're replacing it with another ship from San Diego. So we're still net one carrier down. But the fact that that's not being taken out of Asia is supposed to be a part of the pivot is kind of strange. I mean, I would impact on the pivot of recent activity, like the ADs and like the new fishing regulations. I think it does create more demand for American involvement. And so it does, I mean, it does have that impact, and something that I think all of us that interact with Chinese officials and scholars have tried to argue incessantly, you know, when we're charged with causing trouble. You know, it's that literally, seriously, no BS, those countries are coming to us and asking us to get more involved. And granted, there starts to be kind of a back and forth and things take on a life of their own. But there's a very strong demand signal for American involvement in the region. I think Stephanie got to that in large degree too. And so these recent things, I think, just reinforce that there's a need for the U.S. presence. The problem is that we can't always say it, and actually, in my opinion, we shouldn't always seek to say it in exactly the way the Singaporeans tell us to, or anybody else in the region.
And frankly, it really does have to be much broader than military.
Yes.
Yes,
It needs to be cultural, it needs political, economic, that stuff, you know, the Pentagon can turn on a dime in a way that other agencies can't. Some of these other, you know, softer sort of smart power agencies that do diplomacy are not as well funded. It's just vital that the pivot is more than seen, because that is what gave rise to the whole containment story, which is now, you know, conspiracy theories, you can never disprove them, right? The more you try to disprove it to the Chinese, the more it's clear that it's a conspiracy and that it's containment. And this is a long-standing thing. It's sort of in Chinese thought, you know, which goes back to the victim mentality, the 100 years of humiliation, et cetera. We're not going to get out of that. But the reality is we need to be present across the board, and there's a lot of steps that can be taken in that regard.
Great. Did you have anything else, Hella? Getting close to the end here.
No, there was
Closing thoughts?
Yeah, well, just one, if I could have a closing thought on something that I haven't mentioned, with a little soft power competition between the United States and China. What almost happened at Voice of America a year or two back, where the Chinese service was almost closed down because Chinese make it impossible for programming to go on the airwaves. Had, you know, caused a good deal of outcry, and also was kind of a wake-up call for people who are interested in soft power diplomacy and competition between the United States and China. And on the other hand, at the same time, we have spoken about this massive global media empire that China has been working on, and even to the point of opening offices just down the street from where we're sitting, and on Times Square, New York. So I just hope that programs like the one we're having today will kind of help highlight that we're in a competition, at least, as at least you could call it, between ourselves and China for our global image, for reaching out to global publics, and it is intense, and we can't forget that.
Can I make a last anecdotal comment?
Please.
So there's a show in Las Vegas now playing at the Palazzo Theater. Have you heard about it? It's called Panda, with an exclamation point. And, you know, this is interesting. You know,
Panda.
Panda. It's one of it. You have to check out the photos because they're pretty insane. It's a one-of-a-kind production that will leave audiences in awe. A visually stunning show which follows the heroic quest of Long Long, a warm and caring panda on an adventurous mission to capture his beloved peacock princess from the malicious demon vulture. Blah, blah, blah. High-flying acrobatics, Shaolin temple, kung fu, stirring music, beautiful dance. You have to check it out. It looks very interesting. And, of course, I think it's important to note that the purchase of AMC theaters, the way in which all movie directors now go to Beijing to get Beijing sign-off, and they literally change scripts because they're looking for a Chinese audience. We haven't talked about this, but, you know, there's a lot happening in the cultural sphere. Yeah, cheers.
All right, well, thank you all for coming out. I particularly want to thank Stephanie for joining us. You're our guest. And so
Thank
we really
you so much.
appreciate
This has
it.
been delightful.
You've
Thank
done
you.
a lot of great
Thank you.
work at ICG, and it's great to have you in town now to
Thank you.
contribute to the debate here.
Lovely. Thank you so much. Thank you.